colonize, if you will, the role of government. And then the third, Sin el Estado, which I'm actually been most fascinated by. And I think that the example of the young lord, so there's so much there. And so Sin el Estado is, the way they describe it is the things that are a need in our community that neither the market is willing to produce and the state is unwilling to do. And so when you look at the history of the Young Lords, the history of the Black Panthers, it is that moment when our communities are so underinvested in, thrown away, at the bottom of the barrel, last in line. And it is those moments when these groups decide we're going to do it on our own, that I think something special happens in the community. And I think aside from organizations, aside from policy changes and campaigns, I think one of the most important things, the most important example of the Young Lords, and one that I think we need to take heed today, is the idea that we are not just consumers. We are not just, que somos más que consumidores as Latinos, that we actually have the ability to create and to produce on our own merits. And the idea of having political imagination reignited in our community, I think, is drastically needed. And it is when we actually lean into the things that are desperately needed, and we seek to do it ourselves. I think that is something that I draw a lot of inspiration from the Young Lords, and I think something that we continue. The last thing I'll say is that in that vein, we created this program called La Vida Local, and for us, the work on the island has been critical. You cannot build a Latino organization in the United States without taking the centrality of the Puerto Rican community, without taking the question of the colonial status of the island seriously. And so we've been very honored and like have worked with a lot of respect and humility with folks on the island. And I think in particular, the question of building outside of the state, meeting communities' needs directly through the work of comedores sociales and like a bunch of other like cooperative movements and stuff that's outside of sometimes the traditional means of activism nowadays, I think is being seen on the island. And I think something we should look to, and we continue to support it. So just wanted to throw that out there as something that I think really draws connections of both historical examples of the Young Lords, but things that are being done internationally today and things that we try to move forward in our work at Mi Gente.
I think I agree with you that organizations like Comedores Sociales, Casa Pueblo, Colectiva Feminista, like I feel like there is a resurgence and an explosion of new organizations reimagining what politics looks like in Puerto Rico. Initially, what is that looking like in the diaspora? Tell us about your organization that has a deep history and how it connects to what we saw in the film and what you see going forward, moving Palante.
Well, I need to say that I saw Palante, Siempre, Palante when I was in Ayer in Puerto Rico, and when I saw it again for this conversation, I found so many parallels with Ayer Puertorriqueño. And when I was looking at watching the movie today, my colleagues were looking at me and surprised, because it was the first time that they were seeing this documentary. And it's because in our context, we are in Philadelphia, we are in the poorest city in the poorest state. And it's not a casualty that we serve Puerto Ricans and Black people. And now the Latinx community is expanding. So that means that our context still being a lot of what we saw in in the streets in New York happening when the Young Lords were founded. So a month ago, the director of Taller Puertorriqueño Education Department did an awesome procession bringing garbage. So from the start, our problems in 2022 in the Puerto Rican community in Philadelphia have exactly the same issues, the same starting points, our context, and the psychological damage that this make is still occurring today. Taller Puertorriqueño has been working since from the cultural heritage and how it's important to understand the value of where you come from to understand where you go. And we see how beautiful it is to see a person that do not understand why they are Puerto Rican if they don't speak Spanish, if they haven't been in the island. And when they understand where and why they are here, how proud they feel. And we see that every semester when we make our students understand where they are. We still struggle with the same things, bad education, food insecurity, job insecurity. And comedores sociales, that is why Patria, Tierra y Libertad was so successful. If you have your belly full, you can understand. If you have a context that they delimitate for your liberty, you are going to be calm. But what our organizations promote is a real liberation of thinking. And I think that identity that we are looking in our organization is very aligned with the Young Lords. We have an awesome archives that tells and preserve and takes space with our culture, with our history, with what it doesn't want to be told, including a lot of the Young Lords information. And we have the biggest bookstore, Julia de Burgos bookstore, that is the biggest bilingual organization, a bookstore in the East Coast. But in Philadelphia, we still feel the divided and conquer that we saw in this movie, because we're still trying to create that bridge to connect with the African diaspora and understand that we were just a different stop, but we are the same and we struggle with the same. So the last thing that I wanted to point out is that we're still struggling and we are creating bridges through a programming like Arthur Schoenberg, in which we discuss every February we discuss, like next year we're going to discuss colorism in the Latinx community. So in many ways, I think Ayer is a wild dream from the Young Lords. And also now, as an executive director, I think we can look forward for this new way of using media. I have seen that media help us to visualize our struggles and what we are doing to fix those struggles, but the action always need to be there. We have seen, like in Puerto Rico, when we fired Ricky Rosselló, that was a combination of the media and the action. So I think those two things need to be always related. So this is some of the parallels that Taller Puertorriqueño have with this amazing experience.
Thank you. Chris, can we hear from you? Chris, can we hear from you about your organization, how you're managing it in relationship to the legacy of the Young Lords? Porque te da gracia.
Are you crazy? She's like, good job sitting still. Well, before I start, I just want to let everybody know that my phone has 1%, so if anybody has a charger, please let me know. To answer your question, I'm the co-chair for local work of New York Puerto Rico Resistance. We're an organization founded in 2019, so we've been going 3 years strong, and we're founded on the principles of, 4 principles. One of decolonization, the second one is the diaspora as integral to the struggle for Puerto Rican independence. I always do this, I always forget the last 2. Decolonization, I'm a little nervous too. Decolonization, diaspora is part of the struggle, liberation by any means necessary, and international solidarity. And so we follow these 4 principles under an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist lens. And so what that means for us, oh man, I have 1% now. What that means for us is we see the situation as Puerto Rico as dire, as a situation that needs to be resolved by working together between the diaspora and in Puerto Rico. So we have a lot of ways in which we do that. For example, we have a campaign that we started called Puerto Rico Not For Sale, Pia No Se Vende, that we collaborate with different organizations such as Philly Boricuas, Jornada Se Acabaron Las Promesas, that is located in Puerto Rico, and a few others. And the purpose of this coalition is to advocate for the abolishment of La Junta. We see La Junta as the fundamental issue that is affecting all Puerto Ricans, because the Junta is what is facilitating the outmigration of Puerto Ricans to create the diaspora in the first place. A lot of the ways that work manifests is through education. And so I'll talk about the media aspect in a second, but in terms of education, we find it really important to talk to people within the diaspora about their personal migration stories. So me, as the chair for local work, I spearheaded a thing where we go in the community of Williamsburg, where we're located, specifically, I don't know if you know La Maqueta in Williamsburg, located on Moore Street. But around that area is where we're based, and we build with that community there because it's a historically Puerto Rican community, and we want to have that foundation. And so we engage in tabling events where people who are walking by notice this giant map that we painted of the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And we ask people to pin on the map where their family migrated from. And the purpose of that is to talk to them about their histories with migration, to get them to understand a little bit more about the imperialist and horrible circumstances that led to the migration in the first place. And we understand that things like Operation Bootstraps in the 50s, Hurricane Maria in 2017, the people that like leave the island for political reasons before 1898. Like these are all reasons that Puerto Ricans have had to come to the United States and leave their homeland. And so we try to create that understanding within the neighborhood while also focusing or understanding what their current needs are. So we've learned a lot about how there is an issue with crime, or how people see crime. There's an issue with food scarcity. And through that understanding, we actually had and are going to restart a food distribution program called Comida Pa' Pueblo, which is the shirt I'm wearing right here, wore on purpose, you know what I'm saying? Where we did a food distribution, a mutual aid program, so that we can meet the immediate needs of the community while also talking to them and advancing their political ideologies of their current situations. We also know that housing is an issue in that community, that the privatization of NYCHA is something that is being targeted within Williamsburg. And to bring that all back, I guess, to media, the ways that we engage with the community isn't solely through tabling with this giant poster of Puerto Rico. Our social media presence is, I feel, very dominant. We post and repost a lot of infographics about things that are happening in Puerto Rico, about what's happening in the archipelago, like protests and stuff like that. We also hand out and create leaflets that we can provide to community members about specific situations. So for example, we have one where we explain what La Junta is. We have one that we explain what Luma is. For those who don't know, Luma is the privatized electric grid in Puerto Rico. We have also done film screenings. Recently, for May Day, we had an event in front of La Maqueta where we had different stations. We had one station where we had an art build. We had another station where people were giving out educational materials. And we had another station where we were showing a film. If any of y'all remember what the name of the film was, please let me know. Anybody know? I forgot what it's called. We showed a film though, it was a good film. We also have had one of my members do a photo project where they're a photographer and they had all these photos that were taken in Puerto Rico, and they had people write down what these images represented to them. Because you understand that Puerto Ricans have a lot of pride for their culture and for where they come from. And although that pride isn't inherently saying, oh, well, we need to be independent, because you have the issue where some people think that statehood is the answer, some people don't care, or some people think that the colonial status that we're in is good enough. They still care about the sanctity of Puerto Rico. And that's something that we try to tap into at all times, because it's hard. The hard work is education, and once we could like tap into the minds of our own people and talk to them about how Puerto Rican independence is the way to go, then, and convince them, then we could start building this movement. Right now, personally, I feel that the Puerto Rican movement is weak. I feel like we have so many issues to deal with in order for it to become to the level that we need it to be to achieve Puerto Rican liberation. In comparison to back in the days when the Young Lords was active, U.S. propaganda has gotten so rampant. Wages haven't increased. People are suffering through horrible poverty, and so it's hard to be an activist. It's hard to organize when you have to have your immediate needs met first. And then just a couple other things that we've done in terms of media, because Edie's gave me a lot of ideas, like, oh yeah, we've done something like that. We have our own newsletter that was going to launch hopefully in August, because it's a lot of work making a newsletter. I don't know how y'all did that every week. Y'all are crazy. But look out for it. It's going to be called Ahora Sí. We've also done parrandas during Christmas time to interact with our people, specifically in the places that they know. Like Puerto Ricans know what parranda is, people know what the words, so that's how we connect with people. And we also believe in perreo combativo. We believe that it's important to be in the struggle, and it's important to have fun in the struggle. And partying, Puerto Ricans love to party, and it's a good way to like get people engaged, because the reason why we're partying is for a celebration. So when Ricky Rosselló, the El Verano Combativo happened, and Ricky finally resigned, we had a party to like commemorate that and to keep the struggle going, because after having all that work for months and weeks of trying to get this guy out of office, we finally did it. So it was something to celebrate. Anything else I want to say? No.
Well, we're going to take some questions. We're going to start to take some questions from the audience in the essence of time. So does anyone have any questions to ask? Please step over. I'll give you the mic. Just so people on the Zoom can hear the question.
Hello everyone, thank you so much. Very beautiful to be here in El Barrio talking about these things, you know, building off of the momentum from the Iram Maristani ceremony, which I think was very important, right? Because we have a vacuum in our community that's being filled by our young people taking pictures on social media. And I think that's what's incredible right now, is seeing how much movement is happening on social media. Like just this last weekend was incredible here in the city. just seeing all across the city how much electrified energy there is. And so my question is, how do we build upon that? I'm just so happy to hear that we are getting a newsletter for Boricua Resistance. That's important. And I'm curious if we know, is there any, news reporting that is bilingual and exclusive to the interests of independence, right? Like, I would love to get to this point where we have some weekly live something where we're talking and engaging and building off the energy of this last weekend, because sometimes, as we all in this room may know, sometimes we want to, scream and shout and hoot, but then where do we go with that energy? I talked about earlier today about, this Becky, like they had the protest in the island earlier this year where, they were on the beach, and then an upper middle class Boricua said, oh, get off the beach, and then we had the counter party on the beach. And I said, amazing having that energy, right, of getting people on the beach and occupying and making the statement that las playas, son del pueblo. But how do we build upon that energy to actually mobilize and make long-lasting change? And I think it is through the media and the information. So I just am curious, building on this topic of media, knowing that it played a big role in the Young Lords' movement, and I think in our movement here now, because we are moving towards somewhere. Do we know of any shows, of any ongoing live media where we're engaging on these things on a weekly basis? I think the newsletter is one way, but we all know how many emails we get in the inbox and how many times that we're clicking them, right? So that's my question, because I think that's the key thing I want us to get to.
That's a 5-in-1 question, but we're going to keep that one pretty brief so we can go to the next one, so you guys can answer the questions as you...
I want to answer the question about the Becky situation first, and then I don't really have an answer for the bilingual kind of show. So if y'all can touch on that, that would be appreciated. But I believe that it's important to tap into that energy because, like I said, Puerto Ricans have this energy embedded within them that they love their island, that they love their archipelago, and they love being Puerto Rican. It's hard to build upon that without leadership. New York Boricua Resistance is a mass organization, and what that means is that we're an organization with membership, and our members are the ones that create the work, and all together we are a form of leadership. We have different chairs for different communities, right? And so it's important to tap into that energy as an organization. And say, hey, you individuals seem very interested in this cause. Would you like to come to our open house? Small plug, New York Boricua Resistance is having an open house this Saturday. So if you'd like to learn more about our organization, it's going to be Saturday from 11 to 2 at the Bushwick Community Center across the street from La Maqueta. I was in the parade this past weekend, and I was marching with Campamento Carrey. And although I really appreciated the work that we did, I appreciated being in the parade screaming La Playa Son del Pueblo, right? But it was also on the other side, not enough direction for the people who were onlookers for what to do next. Puerto Ricans would love to scream and shout, but it's hard to tap into that energy when you're not giving any direction. So for the example in the beach, it would have been good for an organization that's in Puerto Rico to say, oh, we should go there and we should start recruiting people, or we should tell people about an event that we have coming up so they can start getting more involved. Because organizing is something that's hard to do, and it's even harder when you don't have any direction in the first place. If you don't know how to organize, you won't be able to organize. And so there needs to be organizations, there needs to be these mass organizations that are created, and those mass organizations that are created need to be directly from the people who are actively angry and engaging in this work already. It's just that direction that needs to be had to make it worth something, to make it ongoing so that the movement can be built.
Anyone else? So Someone, you would have something?
Well, I would like to debate a little. I think in the island, the activism is so tired. It's so many fights at the same time. The food insecurity, the sabotage from every way, in every direction to the citizens and to the activism. It's impossible to be covering everything. I was an activist, I've been an activist all my life, and it's exhausting, and the state is always against you, and it's so small that they know you, and we're still dealing with a lot of persecution and trauma. So the activism in the island is very different from what we see in U.S., and we need to learn that, because that is what happened to the young lords. They thought that they knew a formula, but the formula is not the same in the island.
Any other questions? And then I'll take you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Denise Garcia, and I wanted to touch upon the issue of mass incarceration, which is something that we haven't touched upon, but it's so prevalent, right, in the Black, African American and Latinx community. I work on the island, in Rikers Island currently, and what comes to my mind is, what is there for incarcerated people, both in and out, right? So many people should be, I believe, in rehabilitation centers versus being on Rikers Island, right? So many people come in, maybe sane, and don't come out the same way they came in, right? And even what, brother, remind me of your name, I'm sorry, I don't have a pamphlet.
Chris.
Chris, even as you were talking about, you know, the newsletters and all of that you're doing, and like, that's incredible. Like, if I could bring the opportunity to my guys and be like, because they're writers, they're, you know, they draw, they're artists, many of them are, and I'm like, what if we can have, I can be that bridge for the guys to, you know what I'm saying, to submit something, whether it's a drawing, whether it's a writing sample, whether it's a poem. And it would mean so much for every, I'm getting like emotional, but one of the things that I get often from them is just a thank you for treating me like I'm human. And it's, I'm like, you are human, you know? Nothing is, because they hear every day animals, savages, pieces of, right? They hear this all day, and so it is so important for me to acknowledge them, and I think for all of us to acknowledge their humanity, because most of them, and many of them, will come out one day. They will come back into our homes, into our blocks, into our communities, and raise their children, and love on, and I work with men specifically, they will love on their wife or their girlfriend, right? And those relationships impact all of us. And in our communities, in our blocks, right, there's so many men that go through the system. And we can't pretend like it doesn't affect all of us. Can't pretend that the anxiety, the depression, the PTSD doesn't affect our community as a whole. And so I just wanted to put that there because it was so present as we were talking, and just, you know, it can be something like just validating them through a poem, through a story, for them feeling like they're being seen and heard. I think just knowing that there are people that see them as human and care about their experiences and what they go through is so significant, and will make a significant impact when they are back out, and if they don't come out within those walls. So yes, I wanted to offer that and ask if that was a possibility for my guys in any of your programs.
Hell yeah. I would love for that. And me and you can connect afterwards in terms of how we can make that happen. But it would definitely be important to have that perspective in the newsletter, because people who are incarcerated are, I would say, closer to the system and an understanding of how. Am I allowed to curse?
Go, say it.
Of how fucked up the system is. And so that would be very, very valuable. And something else that I thought about while you were speaking, we actually have a member who was incarcerated, and he was in jail for, I think, like 15 years. And then when he got out, heard about MYBR and decided to join us. And his journey was very interesting, because he's like 50, like late 50s, early 60s now, and he's missed out on so much, and there's so much for him to catch up on. And some of the things that he had to catch up on is like how, like from his eyes, things are so new in terms of like understanding gender and sexuality and stuff like that. And something that when you were speaking made me think about is like how it's important to have space for that kind of hitting as well, because men who are incarcerated, they don't have a lot of opportunity to unpack some of the toxic masculine ways that they might have to encounter from being incarcerated for so long. And so within the movement, within the Puerto Rican movement as well, it's important to combat the machista attitude or these toxic masculine behaviors that might arise, that you need the space to be able to unpack that kind of stuff. But in terms of the newsletter stuff, I would love to connect with you about that, because that sounds amazing.
Great. I'm going to jump to Iris for a minute, because I wanted to know if, yeah, for you. I can't hear JT. Are you muted, Iris?
No, I'm not.
Stay like that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Who am I speaking to? I want to see you.
Calixto.
Okay, how are you?
Right here. But you don't got to talk to me, you can talk to this whole audience.
All right, so I want to say something about, I'm very happy to hear the conversation about building mass organizations, because that is the issue of organizing people. Because as was said by earlier, we're facing tons of issues. That description that I gave you earlier about where we're facing tons of issues. And so what we need, as the brother was saying, was leadership and organization, because we cannot deal with the individual problems of everybody. So we have to come together to deal collectively to make systemic change. So for example, in the prison issue, do you know how much prison struggles we were engaged in 50 years ago? Do you know that in New York City, African American and Puerto Rican prisoners took over the prisons and created an inmates liberation front and raised a whole slew of demands, and actually forced judges to come to the prison to hear bail cases that were outrageous, and the same day people had to be let go because the prison conditions were horrific. In the Women's House of Detention, one of the strategies that women developed was an inside-outside organizing. I raise this because the other issue that is important for our organizing today is to know the history of the issues that we're involved with, but also to build coalitions and work with others that are doing this work. Because sometimes I think we approach these things like Christopher Columbus, who comes into, the Caribbean and says, I discovered this, when there was already a whole lot of shit going on. And the same thing with these struggles. These are not new. I mean, I love the thing about the archives, because in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia has a very rich history as well. And to document that, I mean, I lived in Philly for 2 years under Rizzo. You know, that was no fun. So I think that we are in a moment of consciousness raising and building organization. And that means looking at what our systemic issues are and bringing people's experiences. Every individual's experience is our collective experience. So that brother that's been in prison, he represents one of us, and there are tens of thousands like him. And then there are African American brothers and sisters that have also had that experience. I would be remiss if I didn't say one thing about the machismo, and because I am a lifelong feminist. I've been fighting this for years. It's not about bad behavior. Men aren't born, like with an illness. We have to think about fighting patriarchy. Just the same way that we talk about capitalism, we have to talk about fighting patriarchy, because we ain't gonna make no revolution if there's racism or gender injustice. And so every single movement, I don't know if in those 4 points that you mentioned, the issue of gender justice is one of your points, but I stress to every organization that you have to deal with the issue of gender, and particularly gender injustice of Black women, because especially after COVID, poverty has intensified, and women are at the center of that poverty around the globe and in the United States, even by, bourgeois reports. So the good news that I'm hearing is that people are building consciousness and building organization. And I think those are the ways to go, and that people are exploring a bunch of strategies and tactics and providing education about history and culture. Culture by itself is not going to get us anywhere. The power of the cultures, what Yarimar was alluding to earlier, culture has always been our inspiration, from the spirituals to the music of Puerto Rico. We integrated all of that as a way to unify us, to have joy, because, Tony Cade said, we have to make revolution irresistible, right? So it has to all be integrated. We're still, I think at this point, one of the things that has happened in the last 50 years is that money has come into activist circles, and so people are siloed off from each other when our struggles are all interconnected. You can't talk about one issue without it affecting something else, but we have organizations that specialize in food insecurity, organizations that specialize in climate justice, organizations. I'm not saying that people don't need to be working in specific areas, but what has happened is that there's competition happening for money, for grants. People always ask, well, where did you get your funding from? And I say, well, we were not a 501c3 organization. We got our funding primarily from the people, right? Through the sales of Palante, through other things, and through donations. We had some anonymous donors that you would be surprised to hear. They didn't want to be known, but they supported us. So my point being that organization is key, that having a vision about that is key. We can have a conversation about the Puerto Rico thing, because the young lords made a big mistake in thinking they were going to go to Puerto Rico, that we were going to go to Puerto Rico and make the revolution in Puerto Rico. The people of Puerto Rico will make the revolution. We have to support. That is our role in the diaspora, but not to think that we're going to go to Puerto Rico. That was the mistake, one of the big mistakes of the young lords. But I just want to leave it there and affirm the organization aspect. the consciousness raising aspect. We also need to make sure that we're working in coalitions and in collaborations with people in this country. You know, that's why Mi Gente's work is so important. That's why building, when we did at City College and all of the universities across the United States, that wasn't Puerto Ricans by themselves or Chicanos by themselves. That was African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And the African American community has been at the forefront of the social justice movement in this country for the last 50 years. And sometimes it saddens me that our relationships are not closer than they are. I leave it there.
We have one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap this up. So, give it to his brother right here.
Hello. Just want to say thank you to the moderator and all the people featured on the panel, the panelists today. My name is Fabrice. I work at the Schomburg Center with my coworker right here. And I want to say thank you again to Iris. Thank you for making this film. It's incredible. I love it so much. My question is pretty simple. So again, yeah, we work at the Schomburg, and we had these young scholars, about undergrads, come in today, and they had all these brilliant ideas about what they're making theses for the summer, and they're not from, most of them not from New York, and they were telling me like, oh, what can we do here? What are you doing? What's things to do around? I'm like, oh, I'm going to the screening of Palante. You should come. And they're like, oh, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's a documentary about the Young Lords, yada, yada, yada. And they're like, Young Lords? Who's that? And I was like, bro! And because they had all these brilliant ideas, like super radical ideas, but I was just like, you know, Young Lords, Black Panthers, Young Patriots, Rainbow Coalition, and they're like, what? What's that? And I guess my question is, how do you, Iris in particular, how do you want the Young Lords to be remembered? Because I think it's also by design that I'm not like blaming these kids or anyone. It's by design that we're not educated about these people in school, obviously. That's a structural reason why we're not taught about these histories, because, I'm sorry, I don't remember the panelists who brought it up, but about political imagination. These sort of things engineer political imagination, and they want to stifle that. So I want to think about just like how orally, because I think that's important, because that's how our histories are shared, is orally or in written forms. Would you like the Young Lords to be remembered when we talk about them in conversation? Because I know we're talking a lot about the future and building a future, but it's also about like decolonizing the past and, you know, creating remembering our history in a radical way, because I feel like these sort of organizations are really the things that help nurture radical political imaginations.
Do you want me to answer?
Take a deep breath.
Well, the first thing for me, and I had the pleasure of meeting you, I guess it was last week. Was it last week or longer than that? But a short time ago, and I thank you for, you know, it's pretty amazing that when I told you that the documentary was, you know, 26 years old, you said, oh, that's older than me, right? So that's great. You know, I love the fact that the documentary continues to inspire and bring information to young people. But what I love more than anything else as part of the legacy is to see kick-ass organizers, because we're part of a historical continuum. You know, we did our part. You know, history called us, like Frantz Fanon says, every generation is called, and every generation makes their contribution or they don't. I feel that my generation made its contribution, and, you know, that we did, and we put the Puerto Rican diaspora on the map. We put the issue of colonization in this country. That we did, you know, we raised questions about health is a human right. But the thing that keeps me going at this age is to see kick-ass organizers. and to see that the struggle continues. That's really what I want to see. And if in the course of some kick-ass organizers, they say, you know, we were inspired by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and Mi Gente and, you know, other folks, then more power to it. But that's what I would say to you. So, you know, I know that Mi Gente has a political education program, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about it, Marisa, because I think that the political education aspect is very important, you know, in all its variety. And training as organizers, as Chris said, you know, you have to train to be an organizer. You're not born one day and you say, oh, I know how to organize. When I was a tenant organizer and I was just in high school, I got trained. And it was the best training that I got, because I was making mistakes along the way about, you know, organizing and how to, you know, bring people together, because organizing is really about bringing people together to take action. That's what organizing is. But anyway, so kudos to the kick-ass organizers on this panel, and you make me very happy.
So we'll leave you to wrap it up, and then, okay, cool. So we want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Appreciate your time and energy. Thank you, JT. And to our translator out there who's reciting every word that we've said in Spanish, thank you so much. And thank you for coming, and by all means, you know, you can talk outside if you can, just so we can clear the room. But thank you all so much for joining us. Take care.